Hello again, dear listener. You've arrived just in time for another haunting journey into history, a story whispered from the shadows of the past, where courage and horror lived side by side. Whether you're drifting into sleep or simply taking a quiet pause from the noise of life, I'm grateful to share this moment with you. Tell me, are you listening beneath the soft glow of the moon, or as the first light of morning brushes the sky? If calm, reflective tales of history bring you peace, I invite you to stay, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why historians still call the trenches of World War I the most hellish living conditions in human history. And to guide us through that darkness, I want you to meet Albert Carpenter, a 19-year-old British soldier whose diary somehow survived the war, even when so many men did not. Albert arrived in northern France in 1916. He was supposed to serve 6 months. He stayed for 2 years. When his family found his diary decades later, they were shocked that a human being could survive what he described. His very first entry began with a single sentence. "The smell hits you first." Not just the smell of death, though there was plenty of that, but of everything rotting at once. The wood, the sandbags, the men, the food, even the water. It all smelled of decay. He wrote, "You get used to it. You have to." Albert didn't know that day that he had stepped into an underground world of misery, a network stretching for hundreds of miles beneath the Western Front. These weren't just ditches. They were tunnels, bunkers, dugouts, an entire city carved into mud, where millions of soldiers would eat, sleep, fight, and die. Imagine standing in a narrow trench, 7 feet deep, 6 feet wide. The walls held up by planks and sandbags. Above your head lies no man's land, a shattered landscape of mud, craters, and corpses. You're not alone down there. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men crowd beside you. This is your world for weeks, sometimes months. You eat here. You sleep here. And often, you die here. But before the enemy bullets or poison gas, the first enemy to greet every soldier was the rat. Albert mentioned them almost every day. "Big as cats," he wrote. "They've gotten fat on the dead." At night, you could hear them, scratching, fighting, running over your boots. Sometimes, you woke up to one sitting on your chest, staring at you with its cold black eyes. Why so many rats? The answer is brutal. Bodies were everywhere, soldiers buried hastily in trench walls, corpses left in no man's land, unreachable under constant shellfire. The rats fed on them. They multiplied. They lost all fear of man. Private James Morrison wrote, "We buried the lads right in the trench wall, covered them with dirt and wood. But the rats knew. They always knew. After heavy rain, the bodies would shift, a boot here, a hand there, and the rats would swarm. Some became so enormous and fearless that they chewed through leather boots, stole food, and even attacked the wounded." Albert wrote of one terrible night. "Henderson was hit yesterday. Couldn't move much. This morning, we found him screaming. The rats had gotten to his bandages, and worse. Much worse. We had to end it. Couldn't let him suffer." But the rats weren't the only monsters in the trenches. The mud itself was alive, a thick, poisonous soup of blood, rot, and chemicals. Men sank into it and never came out. Corporal William Hayes described it. "The mud here isn't like back home. It grabs at you. Thompson stepped off the boards and vanished up to his chest. Took 4 of us 20 minutes to pull him out. His boots never came up. Wooden planks called duckboards lined the trench floors to keep men above the worst of it, but they often broke or were blown apart. When they did, soldiers had to wade through the muck. That's when trench foot spread a gruesome disease that rotted flesh while men were still alive. Captain Douglas Hay recorded. Peterson's feet black to the ankles. Amputated this morning. Don't think he'll survive the infection. 3rd case this week. Running out of morphine. Then came the lice. Every man had them. They lived in uniforms, laid eggs in seams, and spread typhus through entire battalions. Albert described the morning ritual. Strip down. Check every seam. Crush the lice with your nails. Wilson killed 47 today, but it doesn't matter. By nightfall, you're crawling again. The constant itching drove men half mad. Some clawed their own skin raw just for a moment's relief. But perhaps the most terrifying thing was how quickly horror became ordinary. At first, Albert described every gruesome detail in disbelief. But 3 months later, his tone changed. Found Peterson's head in the soup pot this morning. Bit annoying. Had to make new breakfast. Men used corpses as furniture. They slept beside the dead because there was nowhere else. Private Robert Chin wrote. You stop seeing them as people. They're just part of the trench now. Mackenzie's been dead for 3 days, but he makes a good windbreak when I'm lighting a cigarette. The stench was everywhere. Rotting bodies, unwashed men, poison gas, spoiled food, it all mixed into one unforgettable smell. Albert wrote. You can't escape it. It's in your nose, your mouth, your lungs. I dream of clean air, my mother's kitchen, but I wake and it's still here. Even decades after the war, some veterans said certain smells, like damp soil or bad meat, could bring it all rushing back. Food was another cruel joke. Hard biscuits too tough to chew, canned beef that stank of rot, jam crawling with maggots. Today's beef was green around the edges, Albert wrote. Smelled foul, but you eat it anyway. Tomorrow there might be nothing. Water came from shell holes, contaminated by chemicals and corpses. Soldiers used purification tablets, but the taste of death never left. Sergeant Patrick O'Sullivan once wrote. Day 12 without rations. Found a dead horse. Cut meat from the flank. Tasted like leather, but it was food. Amid the misery, one ritual gave relief, the daily rum ration. A small cup of dark rum that dulled the pain and fear. The morning rum is salvation, Albert said. It burns your throat, and for a moment, the smell isn't so bad. The rats don't seem so large. The mud feels less cold. Some soldiers saved both rations for the night to help them forget where they were. Others grew addicted, trading food or bullets for just one sip. Without rum, reality hit hard. Every smell, every scream, every horror came flooding back. The mental strain was unbearable. Shell shock, they called it then, what we now know as PTSD. Albert wrote. Crawford just started walking today. Up the trench wall, straight into no man's land. We called him, but he didn't turn. The machine guns got him 50 yards out. Found a note, I can't anymore. Constant shelling shook the earth day and night. The ground trembled. The air cracked open. Even when the explosions stopped, the silence was worse. "The quiet times are the worst," Albert said. "That's when your mind starts working again." Men heard voices, saw ghosts, talked to dead friends as if they were still there. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Wounded men lay for days waiting for help. Infections spread like wildfire. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, one of the few women near the front, wrote. A boy, maybe 17, came in with a shoulder wound. Should have been easy to treat, but it had festered 5 days. We had to take the arm to save his life. Surgery was often done without anesthesia. Men bit leather straps to keep from screaming. Many soldiers were just children. They lied about their age, too young to shave, sent to die in foreign mud. Albert remembered one. New kid says he's 18. Looks 15. Keeps asking when he can write to his mother. Doesn't know mail only goes out if we're alive to send it. These boys grew old overnight, learning to amputate, to kill, to watch their friends rot beside them. In the trenches, the social classes of Britain disappeared. Aristocrats and farmers, bankers and miners, all equal in filth, fear, and death. Albert wrote. Lord Peyton's son cries in his sleep every night. I hold him like my little brother. Out here, it doesn't matter who your father is. We all breathe the same stink of death. Then came winter, the coldest enemy of all. Water froze, rifles jammed, boots stuck to the ground. Private Samuel Winters described it. Woke up and couldn't feel my feet. Boots frozen to the boards. Had to pour tea to break them free. Frostbite claimed as many lives as bullets. Hands, feet, gone to the cold. Doctors learned to saw through frozen flesh that looked more like butcher's meat than human skin. The damp and chill combined to create open wounds that never healed. As the war continued, life in the trenches became a slow descent into madness. The endless bombings and gunfire were not just physical battles, they were attacks on the mind. Day after day, the soldiers lived under the constant roar of artillery shells that fell without warning, shaking the ground and rattling the soul. Even when the shelling stopped, no one could truly rest. The silence that followed was almost worse, a heavy, unnatural quiet where every man could hear his own heartbeat and the distant cries of the wounded lying out in no man's land, calling for help that would never come. Many soldiers began to lose their grip on reality. They called it shell shock at the time, but today we know it as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some men would simply snap, standing up and walking straight into enemy fire as if welcoming death. Others stopped speaking entirely, staring blankly at the mud, the rats, or the remains of their fallen friends. Albert wrote that after a while, even fear began to fade. You stop being afraid of dying, he said, because dying feels like the only way to escape. Sleep became rare, and when it came, it brought nightmares worse than the waking hours. Men dreamed of home, of mothers and sisters and quiet fields, only to wake to the stench of death, the scurrying of rats, and the sound of distant gunfire. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, typhus, and influenza struck entire units, killing hundreds without a single bullet fired. Medical supplies were short, doctors were few, and the wounded often lay for hours in filthy dugouts waiting for help that might never come. In those conditions, even a small cut could turn deadly. Amputations were performed with dull tools and little or no anesthesia. Soldiers bit down on belts or wooden sticks to stop themselves from screaming. Some never woke up again. But despite it all, life continued inside the trenches. Men laughed, sang songs, wrote letters home, and held on to small pieces of hope. They found comfort in friendship, in the brotherhood that came from suffering together. Albert wrote about sharing his last piece of bread with a man he barely knew, simply because both of them understood that tomorrow either one could be gone. In the frozen winters, men huddled together for warmth, their breath turning to mist, their uniforms stiff with frost. Frostbite took fingers and toes. Men would wake to find their boots frozen to the ground. Some mornings, they had to pour tea on their feet just to move. The dead froze in place, their faces locked in expressions of pain that would stay there until spring thawed the ground enough to bury them. Yet through all this, orders kept coming, battles kept raging, and young men kept arriving to replace the ones who never came back. By 1918, the trenches had claimed millions of lives, not just from bullets, but from hunger, cold, disease, and despair. When the war finally ended, the survivors emerged from their underground prisons pale, thin, and hollow-eyed, like ghosts walking among the living. Albert was one of the lucky few to make it home. But even there, peace did not come easily. He wrote that he could still hear the distant thunder of guns when the wind was right. He could still feel the mud under his boots and smell the rot in his nostrils. The war had ended, but for the men who lived through the trenches, it never truly stopped. The First World War was called the war to end all wars, but for those who saw the rats, the mud, and the endless death, it was simply the war that ended everything they once were. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world rejoiced. Bells rang in cities and towns across Europe. Families wept with relief, believing that peace had finally returned. But for the men who came out of the trenches, peace was only a word. They had left a part of themselves behind in the mud, buried with their fallen brothers, their youth, and their innocence. The soldiers who returned were no longer the same men who had gone to war. Many were haunted by memories too painful to share. They woke in the middle of the night, hearing explosions that no one else could hear. They avoided crowded places, flinched at sudden noises, and stared at empty spaces as if seeing ghosts. Some refused to speak of the war at all, while others could not stop talking about it. Families tried to understand, but how could they? No one who hadn't lived in those trenches could imagine the horror, the constant fear, the crawling rats, the endless mud, the sight of a friend's body beside you for days because there was no safe way to bury him. Albert wrote one final entry in his diary in 1919, months after returning home. "They say the war is over," he wrote. "But I still feel the ground shake when I close my eyes. I still hear the rats. I still smell the mud." His words spoke for millions of soldiers who carried invisible wounds that never healed. Many could not find work when they returned. Their bodies were broken, their minds shattered, and their dreams gone. Some took their own lives, unable to escape the memories. Others turned to drink to silence the screams that lived inside their heads. But there were moments of hope too. Some soldiers found strength in rebuilding their lives, in families, in friendship, in remembering those who never came back. Monuments were built in cities and villages, engraved with the names of the fallen. Mothers, wives, and children would visit these memorials, running their fingers over carved letters, imagining their loved ones smiling somewhere beyond the pain. In every town, there were empty chairs at dinner tables and unopened letters that never reached home. Historians later said that the First World War changed the world more than any event before it. It redrew borders, destroyed empires, and created new nations, but it also changed the hearts of men. It taught humanity how fragile civilization truly was. It showed how pride and politics could destroy an entire generation. And it gave birth to new horrors, as the scars of that war would lead to another even greater one only 2 decades later. Albert's diary was eventually discovered by his grandson, buried among old papers in a wooden chest. When he read it, he said it felt like stepping into another world, a world where courage and fear lived side by side, where death was an everyday companion, and where humanity was tested beyond its limits. Today, those diaries, letters, and stories are all that remain to remind us of what those men endured. The trenches may be silent now, covered by grass and time, but beneath that earth lie millions of souls who once lived, fought, and died in the mud. And as the grandson placed the diary in a museum, he wrote one line beneath it, a line that captures the spirit of all who suffered in those rat-infested trenches. They fought not for glory, not for medals, but for the hope that someday, no one would have to live like they did again. The trenches of the First World War were more than just battlefields, they were lessons carved into the earth, reminders of human endurance and the terrible cost of war. A century later, the world still carries their echoes, whispering through the silence of old battlefields, where once, among mud, fear, and rats, humanity fought for its very soul. Years passed, but the memory of the trenches never truly faded. Across Europe, the land still bore the scars, deep craters, rusted helmets, and bones buried beneath fields that once ran red with blood. Farmers plowing their lands would still uncover bullets, shells, and fragments of uniforms tangled in the roots of the soil. They called it the Iron Harvest, a grim reminder that even though peace had returned, the earth itself still remembered the war. Villages once destroyed were rebuilt, but the laughter that filled them before 1914 never sounded the same again. There was always a silence between words, a silence of loss, of things that could never be spoken. The veterans of the war gathered every year on Armistice Day, standing shoulder to shoulder in silence as the world bowed its head for 2 minutes. The bugle's cry of "the last post" echoed through cities and cemeteries, carrying the grief of millions. They wore their old medals, polished and shining in the morning light, but behind those medals were haunted eyes. Some stood with canes, others in wheelchairs, and many stared straight ahead, not at the present, but at the ghosts of their youth lost in the mud. People would lay wreaths of red poppies at the memorials, the bright flowers symbolizing both blood and hope. The fields of Flanders, once battle-scarred and barren, became covered in poppies, a living reminder that even in death, life finds a way to bloom again. In schools, children were taught about the bravery of those who fought in the Great War. But no textbook could ever truly capture the smell, the fear, or the endless days of rain and rats that those men endured. The soldiers themselves rarely spoke of it. Some burned their uniforms and letters, wanting to forget. Others kept silent because they believed no one would ever understand. Albert's grandson once said that when his grandfather talked about the war, his eyes would turn distant, as if he were still there, still listening to the rain hit the trench walls. As decades passed, the number of surviving soldiers grew smaller. Old men now, they gathered less often, their ranks thinning year by year. But even as their voices faded, their stories lived on in diaries, letters, and photographs, in black and white images of boys who looked far too young to die. Their words became history, but for them, it had been life, raw, brutal, and real. When the last veterans passed away, the world entered a strange silence. There were no more living witnesses to the trenches, only their written memories. Yet, every year, people still gathered at dawn, laying poppies and candles, whispering prayers for men they had never met. Because somewhere deep inside, humanity understood that the price of forgetting would be too great. The trenches were not just a chapter in a history book, they were a warning carved in mud and blood, a lesson written by millions of lives lost to pride and power. Even now, a century later, travelers who walk through the preserved trenches in France say they can still feel something. A heaviness in the air, a quiet whisper of sorrow that lingers between the earthen walls. Some say that on rainy nights, the wind sounds like distant crying, or the shuffle of boots on wet boards. Maybe it's only the imagination, or maybe the earth never forgets those who suffered upon it. Albert's diary now rests behind glass in a war museum, open to the final page. Visitors stop and read his last words, written in faded ink. We lived with the rats, we slept beside the dead, and we waited for dawns that never came. But through it all, we never stopped hoping that someday, the world would learn. Those words still echo today, a century-old plea from a young soldier who lived and died among the mud, the fear, and the endless swarm of rats. The trenches may be gone, but the ghosts of the Great War remain, not to haunt us, but to remind us of the cost of forgetting what humanity is capable of, both in cruelty and in endurance. More than 100 years have passed since those dark days, yet the echoes of the trenches still linger, in the ground, in the stories, and in the hearts of those who remember. The generation that fought in the First World War is gone, but their voices live on through fragile pages of letters, photographs, and journals like Albert's. In them, we can still hear the beating of human hearts that refuse to surrender, even when surrounded by death and despair. Those men did not fight for glory or conquest, most of them barely understood the politics that sent them there. They fought because they had no choice. They fought to protect their friends, their brothers in arms, and the faint hope that one day the world might see peace again. Today, when visitors walk through the preserved trenches of France and Belgium, they are struck by how small they are, narrow, claustrophobic, and silent. The walls are still damp. The wooden planks creak underfoot. It's hard to imagine that millions once lived, fought, and died in spaces no wider than a man's shoulders. The air feels heavy, as if it still remembers the fear, the prayers, and the cries for mercy that once filled it. Tour guides tell stories of rats the size of cats, of nights when the rain never stopped, and of young boys who whispered their mothers' names before the shells came down. And when people listen, truly listen, they realize something profound, that the story of the trenches is not just about war. It's about the endurance of the human spirit, the will to survive even in the darkest place on earth. It's about courage born from desperation, friendship born from suffering, and hope that refused to die. The rats ruled the night, the mud swallowed the weak, and death stalked every heartbeat, yet somehow, humanity endured. Albert's grandson once said that his grandfather never saw himself as a hero. He said the heroes were the ones who never came back, he explained during an interview. He said his only wish was that no one else would ever have to live through what they did. Those words, simple but pure, became the heart of his family's story, a message passed down from one generation to the next. In every war since, soldiers have looked back at the trenches of World War I with both horror and reverence. They see in those men a reflection of what they might one day become, not just fighters, but survivors of something far greater than battle. And as time moves forward, the lessons of that war become more important, not less. Because every time humanity forgets, every time nations march toward conflict again, the ghosts of the trenches rise silently from the earth, whispering their warning, "We have seen what comes of this. Turn back." As the sun sets over the fields of Flanders today, it paints the land in shades of red and gold. The wind moves through the tall grass, carrying a soft sound, perhaps the rustle of poppies, or perhaps something deeper, a distant echo of the voices that once filled those fields. In that quiet, one can almost hear Albert and the millions like him, young, frightened, yet brave beyond measure, whispering through time. We were the soldiers of the mud. We lived among the rats. We saw the world end, and still we hoped. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all, that even in the darkest corners of human history, where death crawled beside them and hope seemed lost, they never let go of their humanity. The trenches of the First World War were not only graves of men, but of innocence. Yet from that darkness, a light still shines, the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. So when you stand before a war memorial, or see a red poppy swaying in the wind, remember them, the boys who became men too soon, who faced horror with courage, and who lived and died in the rat-infested trenches of the Great War. Their story is not just history. It is a reminder that peace, though fragile, is the most precious thing we have. When the guns finally fell silent on the morning of November 11, 1918, a strange stillness swept across the Western Front. The soldiers could hardly believe it. For 4 long years, the earth had known nothing but thunder, the booming of shells, the screams of the dying, and the endless rattle of machine guns. Now there was only silence, a silence so deep it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Albert described that morning in his final diary entry. At first, no one cheered. We just stood there, waiting for another shell, another burst of fire. But none came. Only the wind, and the sound of birds, real birds, singing. I had forgotten what that sounded like. For the men who survived, peace felt unreal. They had dreamed of it for years, but when it arrived, it brought no joy, only emptiness. They looked around at the ruins of the world they had once known, at the shattered trees. Some soldiers cried openly, not from happiness, but from exhaustion. Others stood motionless, staring into the distance as if they could still hear the echoes of artillery. They were free to go home, but home no longer felt like a place that existed for them. When Albert returned to England months later, he carried more than just the scars on his body, he carried the ghosts of those trenches in his mind. The first night he slept in a real bed, he woke up screaming, convinced he was buried alive beneath the mud. The sound of rain on the roof sent him trembling, because it reminded him of shells falling. And when he saw a rat scurry across his kitchen floor, he fell to his knees and wept. He wasn't alone. Across Europe, millions of men came home to lives they no longer recognized. They had seen too much, lost too much. The world had moved on, but inside, they were still trapped in the trenches, listening to the rats, the gunfire, the cries of their friends. Many never spoke of what they saw. Some tried to rebuild, to marry, to work, to forget. But late at night, in the quiet, the memories came back, uninvited, unstoppable. Albert wrote only once more, in a small note tucked into the back of his diary. It read, "We came home, but part of us never left. The mud still clings to us, even after all these years." He lived a quiet life after the war, working as a schoolteacher. He married, had 2 children, and rarely spoke of his service. But sometimes, on rainy nights, he would sit by the window with a glass of rum, staring out into the darkness, and whisper the names of the men who didn't come back. His wife would find him there, silent tears in his eyes, as though he were listening to voices only he could hear. The world called it the Great War, as if greatness could ever describe something that took so many lives. Entire villages lost their sons. Mothers received letters instead of embraces. Wives waited for years, only to bury the memory of the men they loved, and those who did return brought the war home with them, in their nightmares, in their silence, in the way they stared too long at the horizon. But the trenches, those dark, rat-infested labyrinths, became symbols of both suffering and strength. They showed what humanity could endure, and what it should never endure again. They taught the world about the true cost of pride and the fragile nature of peace. Even today, if you visit those fields in France, you'll find the scars still visible in the earth. The grass grows over the old craters, but the ground still dips and swells where the trenches once ran. Sometimes, after heavy rain, pieces of the past rise to the surface, a rusted helmet, a corroded bullet, a fragment of bone. The land remembers, even when people forget. In one of his final interviews, Albert's grandson said, "He never spoke about heroism. He spoke about hunger, about fear, and about the men he loved like brothers. He said the real heroes were the ones who stayed behind, buried in the mud, with no names left on their crosses." And maybe that's the truest legacy of all, that war creates no victors, only survivors. The trenches of the First World War remind us that even when humanity loses itself to madness, there is still a spark of hope that refuses to die, a small, stubborn light that endures through the darkness of time. So the next time you hear the sound of rain, or see a field of red poppies swaying in the wind, remember them. Remember Albert. Remember the millions who lived and died among the rats and mud, who faced hell on earth and still found the courage to hold on. Because as long as we remember, they are never truly gone. Decades have passed since Albert's last words were written, yet the echoes of that war still live quietly beneath our feet. The fields that were once battlefields are now calm and green. Children play where once the earth burned. Farmers till the soil, unaware that just a few feet below, remnants of that old world still sleep, helmets, rifles, and the bones of the forgotten. Every year, the plows turn up new reminders, a rusted medal, a shattered bayonet, a water bottle still engraved with a soldier's name. The war may have ended, but the land remembers everything. In France and Belgium, they call it the Iron Harvest. Even today, more than 100 years later, farmers still unearth thousands of unexploded shells every spring, silent killers from a war that refuses to stay buried. The soil bleeds history. And sometimes, when the fog rolls over those quiet fields, locals say they can almost hear distant whispers, the faint rumble of artillery, the soft echo of boots marching through mud, the faraway cry of men long gone. Time has softened the horror, turned it into stories told in museums and classrooms. But behind every statistic, behind every black and white photograph, there was a heartbeat, a human soul like Albert's, who once stood in the mud, shivering, afraid, and yet somehow still hopeful. That's the part we often forget, that those soldiers were just people. Sons. Brothers. Lovers. Ordinary men trapped in extraordinary hell. Albert's diary now rests in a museum in London, its pages yellowed with age but still legible. Visitors lean in close to read his handwriting, shaky, hurried, yet clear enough to feel his voice through time. If anyone finds this, one page reads, "Tell them we tried our best. Tell them we were young, and we were scared, but we stayed." Simple words. But in those words lives an entire generation's truth, that they endured the unendurable not for glory, but because they had no other choice. When historians call World War I the war to end all wars, they do so with a bitter smile. Because the world did not learn, not fully. Only 2 decades later, the bombs fell again, the trenches filled again, and the sons of the men who survived the Great War were sent to fight their own. History repeated itself, as if humanity still hadn't learned how precious peace really is. But even so, there's something immortal about what those men left behind. Not in the weapons, not in the ruins, but in the lessons they carved into time itself. The trenches taught us what happens when pride replaces compassion, when politics outweigh humanity, when young lives become numbers in someone else's ambition. They showed us the limits of suffering, and the boundless strength of those who survive it. And in a strange way, the rats, those dark symbols of filth and decay, became part of that story too. They thrived where humans suffered. They fed on death and multiplied in the shadows. Yet in their own way, they remind us of how life always persists, even in the most impossible conditions. The rats, the mud, the cold, all of it was hell. But even in that hell, there was laughter sometimes, a song hummed quietly in the dark, a letter passed from one trembling hand to another. There was still humanity, fragile, flickering, but real. Albert once wrote, near the end of his diary, "If we survive this, maybe we'll understand what peace means. Maybe we'll learn to hold it close and never let it go." It's a promise that every generation has to make again, and again. Because peace is not something we inherit. It's something we must protect. And so, when the last light fades over the fields of Flanders, and the air grows still, you can almost hear the past breathing, a soft wind moving through the poppies, whispering the names of those who never came home. The mud has swallowed their bodies, the world has moved on, but their story remains. They were boys who became men before their time. They fought, they feared, they fell. And in the end, they gave us a truth that time can never bury, that even in the darkest pit of despair, there is still light. So tonight, as you listen to this story, wherever you are, whatever hour it may be, take a moment. Close your eyes. Hear the quiet. And remember them. Remember Albert. Remember the millions who lived and died in the rat-infested trenches of the Great War. Remember that peace was paid for, not with words, but with blood, with mud, and with unimaginable sacrifice. And perhaps, if we remember well enough, we will never have to return to those trenches again. Years turned into decades, and the world moved on, or at least, it tried to. Cities were rebuilt, new wars came and went, and history books began to summarize the Great War in tidy paragraphs. But for those who had lived it, or grown up in its shadow, the scars never truly faded. Albert grew old quietly. His hair turned gray, his hands trembled, and the once strong voice that had shouted over the roar of gunfire became soft, gentle, and slow. Children in his village would sometimes visit him, fascinated by the medals he kept in a wooden box under his bed. They'd ask him questions. Was it scary? Did you win? Did you kill anyone? Albert never spoke of killing. He never told them about the screams, the smell, or the rats. He would only smile sadly and say, "We survived." That's all that mattered. Then he'd close the box and change the subject. On quiet evenings, he'd sit by the fire with his grandson and tell stories, not of war, but of friendship. He'd speak of Wilson, the boy who could make everyone laugh even when the bombs fell. Of Henderson, who loved to sing old folk songs at night. Of little James, who carried a letter to his mother in his pocket until the day he died. They were good men, Albert would whisper. All of them. And I hope wherever they are now, they've found peace. When Albert passed away in 1963, his family found the old diary tucked away in a drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, the pages worn but still intact. Inside, there were words they had never seen before, words he must have written years after the war. We thought the mud would swallow us. But maybe it preserved us instead, in memory, if not in body. Perhaps that's how we stay alive. Not in statues or medals, but in the stories we leave behind. His family decided to donate the diary to a museum. The curator who received it wept as she read it. She said she could almost smell the damp earth between the lines, almost hear the scraping of boots on wooden boards. Albert's words became part of a larger collection, voices of soldiers, nurses, doctors, and families, all piecing together the human story of the war. Years later, when that museum opened a new exhibit on trench life, Albert's diary sat in a glass case beneath soft light. Visitors leaned close, reading the words of a 19-year-old who had seen the very worst of mankind, and still found a way to speak softly about hope. Children on school trips asked their teachers, why did they have to live like that? And their teachers, often with trembling voices, would answer, because the world forgot how much peace is worth. Outside, near the museum's entrance, there's a memorial garden filled with red poppies, one flower for every soldier who never came home. In the middle stands a single wooden cross, simple and unadorned. At its base are carved the words from Albert's final note. Every year on November 11th, at exactly 11 a.m., the garden falls silent. The traffic stops. People bow their heads. The air itself seems to hold its breath. For 2 minutes, the world remembers. And in that silence, between the ringing of the bells and the whisper of the wind, you can almost hear the heartbeat of those who lived and died in the trenches. Even now, scientists say that parts of the Western Front remain dangerous, unexploded shells still lie buried under the soil, waiting silently beneath farmland and villages. Each one a reminder that the past never truly disappears. Farmers still uncover bones every spring, jawlines, helmets, name tags, fragments of lives interrupted mid-breath. The war may have ended, but the earth still holds their story. And perhaps that's how it should be. Because to forget them would be to betray them, those young men who once stood waist-deep in mud, surrounded by death, yet still found the strength to write letters home saying, "Don't worry, I'm fine." Their courage was not in their fighting, but in their enduring, in their ability to keep believing, even when the world had gone mad. Albert's great-granddaughter, now an old woman herself, once said in an interview, "When I read his diary, I can feel him there, cold, afraid, but alive. He wasn't just my great-grandfather. He was a boy who wanted to go home." I think every soldier in those trenches wanted the same thing. And maybe that's the truest meaning of remembrance, not to glorify war, not to romanticize suffering, but to remember that beneath every uniform, there was a heart that beat for home. As the years drift on, the living memories of the Great War are almost gone. Soon, no one will remain who heard those voices firsthand. But their stories, their words, still breathe. They live in every poppy, every whisper of wind across the old battlefields, every diary kept safe by loving hands. And when you stand in those quiet places, among the ghosts of the past, you can almost hear them whisper one final truth, a truth carved into history itself. We were here. We suffered. We endured. Remember us, not as soldiers, but as men who once dared to dream of peace. Years fade into centuries, and yet, the earth still remembers. When the rain falls over the old battlefields, it carries whispers from beneath the soil. The drops strike the ground softly, washing away time but never memory. Somewhere beneath that damp earth, fragments of the past still rest, a dented helmet, a muddy shoe, a photograph sealed in a tin box, and the echoes of laughter that once dared to survive in hell. Each year, when spring arrives and the poppies bloom once more, their bright red petals sway like small flames, reminders of all the young lives extinguished too soon. The locals call them flowers of blood, because they grow best in the soil that once drank so much of it. The trenches themselves are gone now. Nature has reclaimed what men once destroyed. Grass has covered the scars, trees have grown over the craters, and the rats, those silent witnesses of suffering, have long since vanished into history. But if you listen closely on a foggy morning, you can almost hear it, the faint clinking of metal, the distant echo of boots trudging through mud, the ghostly hum of men singing to keep their sanity in the dark. War leaves no victors. Only survivors. And survival, as Albert once wrote, is not the same as living. The world called them heroes. But Albert never thought of himself that way. In his diary's final pages, his handwriting grew shaky, uneven, like a man trying to hold back tears even decades later. They gave us medals, he wrote, but not peace. They told us we were brave, but bravery is just fear dressed in silence. I didn't fight because I wanted to. I fought because the boy next to me needed someone to believe we could make it home. Those words became his legacy. And through them, the Great War became more than a story of generals and maps, it became a story of faces, of trembling hands, of friendships forged in the darkness of despair. Albert's diary now lies behind glass, but his words still move hearts across generations. School children read them, veterans visit to pay quiet respect, and historians still find new meaning in his simple lines. And every year, on Remembrance Day, someone places a single poppy beside that glass case, one bright red bloom against the pale yellow pages, a promise that he, and those like him, will not be forgotten. In the soft hush of remembrance, a question always lingers, was it worth it? Did the world truly learn from their suffering? Maybe not completely. The century that followed still saw wars, still saw hatred, still saw men forget the cost of peace. But every time humanity edges close to darkness again, the stories of men like Albert pull us back, reminding us what happens when we stop seeing each other as human. And that is why stories like his must be told, again and again, not to glorify, but to remember. Because remembering is not about the past. It's about protecting the future. As dusk falls over the fields of Flanders, a soft golden light stretches across the horizon. The wind moves gently through the poppies, carrying with it the scent of rain and soil. Somewhere in that silence, you can almost hear it, a heartbeat. Not of war, but of memory. Albert's voice fades with the wind, his final words lingering like a prayer. If peace ever returns, hold it close. Hold it as if it were a wounded friend. The screen slowly fades to black. The poppies blur into the mist. And the last sound you hear, before the silence takes over, is the faint rustle of pages turning, like the breath of history itself. Because in the end, the trenches are not just in the ground, they live in us. In our choices, our compassion, our need to remember. And maybe that is the greatest victory of all. That the men who died in the mud are not forgotten in the noise of the modern world, but live on in the hearts of those who still believe in peace. Even after the guns fell silent, the war never truly ended. For years, the men who came home from the trenches carried the battlefield inside them. The mud had washed from their boots, but not from their minds. They would wake in the middle of the night, gasping for air, convinced they were still buried under the earth. The sound of a passing train became the rumble of artillery. A flash of lightning, the burst of a shell. People called it shell shock back then, though no one truly understood it. There were no words for invisible wounds. These men had survived the front lines, but they found themselves strangers in a world that could not comprehend what they had seen. Their families would watch them stare into nothing for hours, their eyes lost somewhere far away, back in those damp tunnels of fear. Some found comfort in silence. Others in drink. A few wrote poetry, as if the only way to heal was to bleed through words. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, names that still echo through time. Their verses were not about glory or victory, but about the mud, the screams, the unending nightmare that followed them home. Albert, too, was one of them. Though his family never spoke of it aloud, they could see it, in the way he flinched at sudden sounds, in how he sometimes sat outside at night, staring at the sky as if counting stars that weren't there. He would hum old tunes from the trenches, lullabies of pain disguised as songs of courage. His wife, Margaret, once wrote in a letter. He never truly returned from that war. His body came back, but a part of him stayed in France, in that dark trench, with the friends he buried. Time moved forward, but Albert's memories remained fixed, like a photograph that refused to fade. He worked in a small post office after the war, sorting letters that reminded him of the ones he once sent home from the front. Each envelope carried the faint scent of ink and hope, things he had nearly forgotten how to feel. And yet, even in his quiet years, there was something enduring in his spirit, a small flame that refused to go out. Perhaps that was the true victory of those men, not that they fought, but that they somehow found a way to live again. Generations later, when Albert's great-grandchildren studied history, they found his name in old records and museum exhibits. They read his words aloud in school plays on Remembrance Day, wearing paper poppies and shaky uniforms. They didn't understand everything, but they felt it, that quiet weight, that deep ache hidden between the lines of his diary. In one classroom, a teacher told them, "Wars are not fought by nations. They are fought by people, people who laugh, cry, dream, and love. And when we forget their humanity, we risk repeating the same mistakes." That truth stayed with them, passed down like an inheritance of memory. Even today, in a world of new wars and new fears, Albert's words echo still. When soldiers march under different flags, when families are torn apart by conflict, the past rises like a shadow, whispering, "We have been here before." The trenches may be gone, the rats may have died, but the lessons remain, carved into history, into conscience, into the soil itself. Sometimes, when visitors stand on those old battlefields at dawn, a soft mist rolls in, and for a moment, it feels as if the past breathes again. The ground beneath them seems to hum, as though filled with restless spirits still waiting to be heard. And in that silence, they understand, the war never ended in noise. It ended in a whisper. A whisper that says, "Remember us, not for how we died, but for how we endured." More than a century has passed since the guns went silent, yet, the war's shadow still stretches across the world. You can feel it in the silence of memorials, in the fields of France and Belgium, where poppies bloom every spring, and in the hearts of those who still carry family stories of courage and loss. The Great War may belong to history, but its lessons remain painfully alive. Every November, the world pauses for a moment, 2 minutes of silence to honor the fallen. Across cities and villages, church bells toll softly, and traffic halts. People bow their heads, young and old alike, standing in stillness as if time itself has stopped. Some close their eyes and imagine the trenches, the cold, the mud, the rats, the faces of boys no older than their sons. Others simply whisper, "Thank you." And though those words may seem small against the enormity of their sacrifice, they carry the weight of everything those men fought for: peace, dignity, and the hope that no one would ever have to live through such horror again. But peace, as history reminds us, is fragile. Not long after the Great War ended, another one began, greater, darker, and far more devastating. Humanity, it seemed, had forgotten its own pain. Yet still, the stories from the trenches lingered, like scars we cannot erase. They became warnings carved into textbooks, reminders spoken in hushed classrooms, echoes inside the hearts of soldiers who came after. When modern troops march into battle today, they still walk with ghosts. Their weapons are different, their uniforms new, but the fear, the loyalty, the longing for home, those things never change. Every soldier, whether in 1916 or 2025, carries the same question deep in his chest: will I make it home? Albert's story, once written in the mud and fear of the Western Front, now lives in the digital world. His diary, preserved online, is read by millions across the globe. Students read his words on glowing screens, historians quote him in lectures, and filmmakers bring his memories to life with sound and light.